Meta developed quite a lot since the last video, so here we are again with another update of the best decks for a ladder. So let's look at it. First deck first, we have a deck that I mentioned last week as a Dark Horse, and it kinda took over the meta. Of course, now the meta adapted to it because this deck was like showing 60% win it for like war week, so of course meta tends to adapt to it. It's not like the best option anymore, I would say, but it's still amazing deck if you especially want to beat things like Janna because it's still doing amazing into Janna. I even made a deck guide on this deck, so you can check that out on my YouTube. Still an amazing choice maybe for a tournament, but not that good as it was last week. Now we started with a segment, I would call it from the past, because we have so many old decks that I just popping off. First is Ashe Leblanc, currently deck with the highest player rate, an amazing, I would say mid-range killer. It's doing very well into most of the mid-range decks. When you look, Jack said there's now Atox gain. Basically, most of the Nemasa decks, things like Atox, we have here Garen Jervan, and go on and go on. Of course, a deck that those struggles into a lot of like control things like PNZ, of course, Janna Nilah, 27% win rate. If they have like very efficient removal or like a lot of stance or something, this deck tends to struggle, but it's still an amazing choice, as we could have seen into the mid range, and especially in like tournament setting where you're able to ban the Janna, then this deck can do very well for you. From the latest set, we have addition of Sky Splitter. Sky Splitter, of course, being a very efficient way how to save your units. And once again, I have a deck guide on this deck on my YouTube. It's one of the first videos that I ever made, and yeah, it's a deck that we just know from the past. We started with Ashe Leblanc like 2 years ago. The second LeBlanc got released, we added LeBlanc to this deck, and then it's just popping off in the good metas, and it's always a meta call into the mid-range stuff. So amazing deck, and if you want to do well, it can be definitely one of the choices. Second deck from the past, a second deck that we know for so long, and it is Shen J4. Once again, kinda mid-range killer if you look at it. It's doing very well into the most of the mid-range. The bad matchups are not that relevant. It's like a lot of random decks. Of course, that can be like a flaw for open because, you sometimes just beat some weird lineups. And of course, Janna Nilah. But once again, in tournament setting, you can ban it. And on ladder, Janna Nilah isn't that prevalent. It's kind of underplayed, right? If you look at it, like Ashe Leblanc is currently the most played deck. And one of the selling points, of course, of this deck is that it's only beating the decks that Ashe Leblanc does, but it's also beating Ashe Leblanc itself because you can see it's 60% matchup. And especially like beating both of the Noxus Pharaoh decks at once is one of the selling points of this deck because not many decks do that actually because they are kind of different, both Darius Gnar and Ashe Leblanc. So that's of course one of the selling points of Shen J4. I think a deck once again that everybody kind of knows, uh, very deck dependent on your champion Shen. Shen is just crazy cat since he got better, and it's very dependent. The second you have the champion, I think this deck just goes crazy and just takes over. Without Shen, it can be maybe a little bit harder, but it's still very good. As well, you have of course like second protector to even like tutor the Shen eventually. So this deck is still doing amazingly. And as said, it's an amazing mid-range killer and one of the best choices for not only ladder but also tournaments. I think another deck, it is Scouts. Once again, deck that we know for 3 years now almost. Like this deck just popping up once again in the current meta, and the deck just does very amazing. If you look at the matchups, it's winning it a lot of things and into most of the matchup. Of course, the stats might be a little bit inflated, so of course keep that in mind. But you're beating things like Janna, you're doing well into things like Jack said. No, even Ashe Leblanc isn't that bad as it used to be. It might be kind of strange for you, but it's because Ashe Leblanc doesn't play Reckoning as it used to in the past, so you don't get that much blown out as it used to be. And it's classically losing to bigger Demacia, things like Jarvan, Atox Kane, or like Atox Vayne. As well, it's losing very often to its draw. But otherwise, one of the best decks that we have currently in the game. And as said, in the last 2 days, it has the biggest win rate on ladders. So amazing choice to definitely consider. Sergeant is one of the new addition. It's for some time in the deck, but it's an amazing addition. Especially when you have like MF on bird. Sergeant can still pull MF, so it's kind of funny that you can have 2 MFs on the bird at one time. And one of the MVPs is of course Champion Strength as well. Especially the change to make it 8 mana but not give Scout is something that this deck doesn't mind that much because some of the units already have Scout, things like Wayne, of course, things like Island Navigators, so you don't mind that much. And one of the also MVP cards that I would say is Inspiring Light, a card that I tend to call Mogwai card because he was like year and a half ago one of the first players to put this card into the scouts. And since then, it's kind of the standard in the scout deck. Amazing deck for climbing and even for tournament play. In the end, something that I think it's definitely worth mentioning is that Janna decks are still good. Of course, they don't show the greatest win rate, but they are still doing very, very powerful things while beating some very good decks that we even mentioned today. Things like Ashe Leblanc are beating both of the decks. For example, Janna Nilah beats Jarvan Chen, while, for example, Janna Teemo beating Jackson as well the Ashe Leblanc and is favorite in the mirror. Something definitely worth mentioning is that there's new build of Janna Nilah that people are using currently. It's more contrary way with things like Elefante and Sunken Temple. Thanks to them, you are a little bit better into bigger mid range, but you are a little bit worse into like more aggressive and like lower to the curve decks. So that's something that definitely is worth mentioning. But I do personally like this build a little bit more, but I do still think that the classic build that we had like last week with the boat and stuff, it's still doing something also very strong, and it's also still worth like keeping in mind because I think if the meta especially evolves, this version might not be the greatest, especially when, for example, people will start playing things like explorers and stuff, and when they're gonna be able to destroy Sunken Temple. If you look at the meta as a whole, we can see that the meta moved in a way that it went from mid-range to be anti-mid-range. So I wouldn't be surprised if before open we see another meta shift, maybe with different decks. Of course, we tend to have some last-minute deck that tends to pop up before open. So sometimes it tends to be bait, sometimes it to be amazing deck and just breaking the game. So it's very hard to say what will happen, but I think the meta is in a healthy state now, and I'm definitely looking forward for maybe some evolutions. And would be surprised if a lot of the decks that I mentioned today wouldn't be that good in a week, for example. But yeah, this been this week update. Are you having success with something else that I didn't mention today? You can leave your opinion or what you're having success with in the comments, and see you in the next video.